I'm a student and this is the only space I have next to a plug point. Cool. All right. So may I please ask the speakers that, so I will be keeping time, but it would be good if you can also time yourselves, and starting tomorrow, we're gonna do the stopwatch thing, because I'm not sure how to do that at the moment. So if anyone gets disconnected, at least we have my timer, making sure that I am tracking. The next thing is, before you speak, please introduce yourself, and also please tell us how you would prefer to receive POIs. Would you rather that the speaker simply interrupted you and said, "Point sir, point ma'am," or would you rather that they put up a card that says POI? Or would you rather that they type on the chat POI, right? So that's your preference, and you get to decide that. Are there any questions?
Just something quickly to note, our team has 2 people with the same name. So just because we had problems in past tournaments, Mariana Icasa is the one speaking, not Mariana Rivero.
Ah, okay, that's useful. I am going to take note of that. Cool. Sorry. Yes, please feel free to display a timer. That's okay. Okay, any more questions? Not, let's start. So I'm also, if any, we now invite the Prime Minister, the first speaker of the proposition side, to begin round 1 of online WSDC.
Hello, am I audible? Okay. My name is Husseina Noorbai. I am the first speaker for side proposition. I think that the normal way of interrupting me for POI sounds fine to me, because I don't think I'll be looking at the chat box while I'm debating, so. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. We live in a world where drug problems are ever existent and cannot be entirely eliminated, and so we can only think of a better way to control and manage them. We live in a world where drug users are stigmatized and prosecuted. We live in a world where drug practices are considered filth because of the effects they bring to the society due to the reason that drug use is unsafe and unregulated. We stand against this world and we want to change the system. So what is our stance? We believe that specific non-residential areas should be designated where drug dealers and users are legally allowed to buy, use, and sell drugs. Some definitions. What are non-residential areas? These are areas that do not have people living in them. They can look like getaway locations or can be no different from social clubs in an area where most nightclubs say are located, where these people are free. They're basically isolated areas where people can engage with drug practices without the fear of arrest or any legal repercussions. They define drugs as all hard drugs, drugs such as heroin, cocaine, marijuana, amphetamine, LSD, etc. As proposition, we have identified 3 main problems in today's debate. The general problem of the debate is that despite its illegality, despite the knowledge that these drugs are dangerous and can kill you, people still continue to buy, use, and sell drugs. The problems of this debate exist on 3 different levels: on a buyer level, on a user level, and on a seller level. On level 1, the problem with the buying of these drugs is that under the current status quo, the buyers of these particular drugs are stigmatized and so are either prosecuted or jailed, i.e. retributed rather than rehabilitated. And the problem with that is that it does not address the root cause of the problem behind why these people use these drugs in the first place. Despite the fact that there are higher penalties for drug possession than, say, third-degree murder, people still continue to buy these drugs. On level 2, the problem with the usage of these drugs is that it is unsafe and unregulated because drug dealers want to work as scrupulously as they can to make the potency of these drugs as high as possible so they can be as addictive as they can. And due to this reason, when people consume these drugs, they become and are perceived as a threat to society. The problem with the sale of these drugs on level 3 is that it is populated by gang members who simply care about your money. So it becomes a very dark business in the world that we know today. Things such as contract killings, drug neighborhoods, murder threats if someone is unable to pay for the so-called drugs. Additionally, we see that all of these problems have historically been confined to residential areas. So all the detriments of the current system and all the problems that I've mentioned before play out or are seen in our homes and in our neighborhoods. Now for some characterization. Justification for legalization. 1, there's a lot of stigma and misconceptions attached to why people use drugs, and this demonizes drug users as people who are delinquent and problematic. See, when you legalize something, you're taking one step towards normalizing it, and normalizing it helps in taking away from its sensitivity and the stigmatization behind it. For example, marijuana users. These people back in the day had been historically stigmatized, but ever since steps have been taken in the decriminalization of marijuana, the stigma behind it has also reduced. Legalization of, why do we justify legalization of hard drugs, something that is proven to be harmful, right? We tell you that we are now able to regulate these drugs in terms of its potency, which makes them a lot less harmful to people. We take away from the hardness of these drugs and we give them the recreational value that they were initially supposed to possess, instead of them being these dark substances that you get you hooked and addicted to them. Some preemption. Despite the fact that there may be other measures in place that side opposition brings to the table, we tell you that no notable improvements have been made to eradicate the root cause of the problem. And if we say that people will use these drugs irresponsibly, we give examples of Netherlands and Portugal where drugs have been decriminalized, and even after the decriminalization of these drugs, the use of these drugs did not increase exponentially, right? Now, the second part of my characterization, what would this look like? This would look like an enclosed area, as I've defined before, with police and security presence, where only consented adults would be allowed to enter or leave. People would not be allowed to enter or leave this place with drugs on them. We would make sure that this is done by the use of frisking. We would make sure that drugs are consumed in regulated amounts and in a safe manner. I mean, no sharing of dirty syringes and things like that. We would make sure that people only leave this place after the high of the drug that they've consumed is worn out, right? Now, the number 3, how we will ensure that drug dealers will buy into the system, right? Except that we don't like the fact that drug dealers need to be brought into the system, but we also can't ignore the fact that there are power players in the system. We would first bring them into the system by removing the illegality of this whole policy, right? How would we do this? We would do this by giving them legal amnesty. This would look like being forgiven or being given no repercussions for drug-related crimes, no sense of jail time. He would be given a clean legal bill of health. This would make it particularly clear to these people who have been previously targeted by the governments that they are no longer wanted, which will draw them into our system out of the shadows. We realize that there might be backlash from society, but we tell you that backlash from society due to this, but we tell you that we'd rather have a world where that backlash is existent, but we are able to confine these people to these areas, which helps to keep future residential families safe from dealing with all of this violence in their neighborhoods, right? We tell you that once we pull in through amnesty, we will ensure that they can maintain the two things that drug dealers really care about: money, which gives them power, and territory, which is a show of control. We will ensure that they maintain their streak of revenue and their territories, except that now it's been a legal, non-residential enclosed area with no fear of facing legal repercussions. We tell you that this is possible because Pablo Escobar, a Colombian drug lord who was successful in bringing drug dealers and the government on the same table to allow for negotiations. Now, Escobar is a bad example to use because of what happened. Once these parties are at the same table, and if negotiations go well, then we can live in a world where the drug industry is a lot more peaceful than the current status quo, where all these people know is violence. We stand a far better chance of building a peaceful society where we can keep future residential families safe from subjected gang violence. Two things will prove to our debate: one, how this allows for better regulation of the drug system in the country, and two, how this will make neighborhoods and residential areas safer in the long run. What? Right? One, how this allows for better regulation of the drug system in the country. 2 points analysis. One, gives way to create an environment for non-opposed regulation. Area where drug users and dealers are legally allowed to practice drugs in a way that they are able to truly apologetically live out their identities in a free way. We create an environment where these people would rather have an area where they're able to do that, even if there is regulation. It's true liberty lies true regulation, but rather two, it enables us to control the effects of these drugs, right? On our side, we first eliminate or disincentivize the black market. But before I go any further, I'll take your POI.
How is stigma taken away when these individuals are placed behind closed doors and branded as
tell you that when you legalize something, you start to normalize it, and when you normalize something, you automatically remove the stigma from it. The stigma only exists because of the denormalization of something, right? Now, this enables us to control the effects of these drugs. On our side, we eliminate or disincentivize the black market, because black markets operate because drugs are illegal. Drug lords. When you provide a legal market that draws in these drug lords, the illegal market ceases to exist. In doing so, we don't see that the price of these drugs will increase any more than it is sold at currently, because the drug lords that we have now convinced to participate in the system will see to it that the same amount of output or profit they're receiving now remains, right? Because we create a way for just one legal market to exist, we're better able to regulate it. We tell you that this enables us to subsequently help us do four things. One, tone down effects of hard drugs, such as paranoia or hallucinations that lead people to commit certain crimes, such as domestic violence, gun shootings, etc. We make the use of these drugs safer because now things such as sharing of syringes and the use of this disease dirty syringes stops. We reduce overdoses and addiction because the potency of these hard drugs has been regulated to make them less harmful to the human body. However, with ensuring that new addicts aren't produced, we are better able to identify previous addicts already exist in the current status quo. It makes it easier for us to get them help, since they are now all enclosed in one area. Is one of our end goals, which is rehab. Under our world, we provide a zone for drug users to get away and consume drugs in a safe amount. We provide a world where negative externalities such as domestic violence, overdoses, and accidents are largely reduced because of the fact that we regulate these drugs. And we provide a world where drug users are cared for, not stigmatized and prosecuted simply because of the way that they choose to live their lives. With that, I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you. We now welcome the first speaker on the opposition side.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Alexandra Maria Gomberg for Team Mexico on opposition. I would prefer for POIs to be given orally and just like unmute yourselves and interrupt me. And yeah, I think that would be all. Am I audible and is all fine? Great, perfect.
Oh, we can't hear you anymore.
Can you hear me? No, I haven't started speaking yet. I'll count myself down.
Okay.
3, 2, 1. The escapist practices of a forever intoxicated West are a product of a market that is quite literally cutthroat. To put it lightly, an ounce of cocaine carries the weight of 10 gallons of blood. Simplifying this premise is what Team Proposition has done when presenting their model. In my speech, a clash between the two models that we are presenting on our side of the house, refutation of their constructive, and our own two arguments. First, on what our model looks like. We tell you that on our side of the house, people found in possession of a certain dosage of illegal drugs cannot be apprehended in police, regardless in what area of the country they are. But their drugs might be taken away from them and they will be invited to speak to a panel of drug counselor, as has been done in Portugal, where in 2001 decriminalization of drugs was implemented. Additionally, drugs are not legal on our side of the houses, and anti-drug PSAs and programs are still supported. There will be great criminal repercussions for those who sell, transport, and produce drugs. We can still support and absorb many of the benefits that they propose on safety by having needle exchanges, clean needle provision, free HIV tests, and narcotic safety tests, as well as rehabilitation on our side of the house. We believe that decentralizing the services is going to achieve far more of the benefits that they claim. But what does their model look like, and why is it comparatively worse? So first of all, they talk to us about how they're going to reduce stigma in prosecution by doing many things within these areas. They believe that these are just going to be non-residential areas with policing and control over the drugs that are being produced. So first of all, on policing, we believe that over-policing these areas is only likely to create more stigma. Considering the fact that there's already existing stigma surrounding drug users in the status quo, what is likely to happen is that the people who are found within these areas are going to be over-policed and targeted for even smaller crimes that are usually not targeted in the status quo. Additionally, on our side of the house, policement is not, consuming drugs is not considered a crime. More importantly, we believe that having this as non-residential areas, secluded areas, is likely just to make these areas non-accessible. We believe that especially with their characterization of these fun and exciting zones, what we believe is going to happen that through regulation, the drugs within these areas are going to be more expensive, meaning that people that are having to consume these drugs on a steady basis are more likely to still consume within the drug market that is not eliminated on their side of the house. Additionally, addicts are more likely to be stigmatized than casual consumers. What about their constructive? So we basically see their constructive divided into three important parts. First, they talk about the problems in this being residential areas in the status quo. They talk about stigma. They talk about regulation. On the problem with these being regulation, these being residential residential areas, we believe that the issues that exist right now are not because these are residential areas, right? We see that people consuming in parks, people consuming near hospitals, is still consuming in non-residential areas. It's still the same detriments that they present on their side of the house. More importantly, we believe that the black market still existent, the people who are going to consume within the residential areas are likely to be the most vulnerable and the most targeted. Secondly, on stigma, we believe these people, since they're still going to consume and not able to choose to go to these areas, they're the ones that are going to be continuing to be stigmatized. These are the vulnerable populations that the other side of the house has to support. Additionally, let's just talk about regulation. We absorb the majority of the benefits, such as clean needle provision, just by telling you that we can spread them around different areas. I mean, we can legitimize this under the decriminalization model that they propose. But more importantly, whenever they talk about the drug dealer incentive for this regulation, we feel like this is unlikely, because what we want to characterize, it's not just one drug institution per country that can just go to the government and lobby with it and say, hey, I want to sell here. The thing is that you're pretty much guaranteeing an influx of profits, which means that drug gangs are going to compete for these areas. This is a clash with my second. With this in mind, we can move on to my own constructive and explain to you how it goes over theirs. So our first argument is called safety blanket. We tell you that these rooms provide the illusion of safety for people who consume drugs. This makes people inside and outside of these areas even more vulnerable to the consequences of the drug trade. There are three stakeholders within this argument: people who don't use drugs, users, and addicts. On people who don't use drugs, we believe that they're more likely to start doing so with the normalization within these areas that they just believe is going to reduce stigmatization. We believe when legalization is only centralized, this is not sufficient. But first of all, the government is no longer diametrically opposed to drug use, so health risks seem fixable to people. When you overdose and you don't die, the effects on your body are still problematic. Secondly, the fear towards drugs is reduced as drug consumption becomes widely visible. Comparatively, on our side of the house, under our model, non-drug users have a negative view of drugs upheld by the government. This is a deterrent for consumption. We see how people continue overdosing on their side of the house in Sydney, where injection rooms found 32 times higher overdose rates than the average rate clients experience before using the facility. However, with decriminalization, users and with it overdoses actually decreased. The Health Ministry of Portugal estimates heroin use dropped from 100,000 in 2001 to 55,000 a few years later. When people do not fear repercussions, they're more likely to approach health workers and seek help. But what about the people who are casual consumers and use sustainably in the status quo? We believe that they're lured into consuming harder drugs because their use is normalized, so the perception of risk is reduced. Especially when heroin, oxycodone, and cocaine are more addictive and more attractive to sell by the drug dealers characterized on their side of the house. They're likely to be marketed and sold to people who otherwise would not be exposed to the normalization of this drug use. Last but not least, the most vulnerable actor within this motion: people who are addicted to drugs. First of all, we believe that they're more vulnerable to abuse from criminal activity from people such as pimps, just because a large concentration of drug addicts is an easy target. Secondly, they have no incentive to seek help because they're actively a part of a pro-drug environment, feeling immune to the consequences of the drug trade. We see it how in Australia, only 1% of people sought rehabilitation from these institutions. Our alternative looks like people not risking going to jail, seeking help. Their personal safety of individuals is in jeopardy. They're not supporting it. No, thank you. But what about drug lords and drug peasants? This is the second argument where we talk even more about safety. The world of drugs is shrouded in organized crimes. This makes the establishment of these spaces while ensuring safety and transparency close to impossible. The control of drug spaces sold in these areas, operators will have to choose between the different suppliers available, right? What ends up happening is one of two things. A, drug groups end up fighting for exclusive market control, overpowering government. The police in this area is not able to reprehend large cartel groups since it has not been able to do so historically. This generates violence, takes lives, the turf wars are created. By adding the opportunity for profits and a government-designated battleground, we make it worse. Why do turf wars exist? Let's just look in New York City. It was found that 44% of homicides involving crack were caused by territorial disputes between competitors. Dealers compete for a small territory, which exacerbates ongoing conflicts. What is the second alternative? It's a monopoly. This is where operators choose their revenue. The government will inevitably show favoritism, which is likely to cause backlash from competing gangs, cartels, or dealers between themselves or towards the government. The most likely way in which they're going to attack is going to by jeopardizing the safety of the consumer. Drugs dealers and cartels are no strangers to killing civilians in the crossfire. Most recently in Irapuato, Mexico, where 26 men were killed in a substance abuse rehabilitation center in what was allegedly a continuation of an ongoing turf war. Decriminalization takes away cartel power by decreasing consumption, as they characterize on their side of the house, while these spaces create a deal between the government and the devil. The designation of these areas allows for an increase in violence from providers who seek market control, affecting everyone in these areas and their surrounding communities. Our counterfactual allows for less criminal control, bringing benefits to consumers and bystanders alike.
Point.
Thank you. That's the end of the speech. So you can only offer points between the 1st and the 7th minute. We thank the previous speaker and we welcome the second speaker on the proposition side.
Hello, my name is Eric Alex. I'll be the second speaker for Proposition Tanzania. And yeah, I prefer people interacting or unmuting their mics to ask POIs. Yeah, I don't prefer chats because I won't be looking at the chat either. So give me a second, I'm just framing my speech. Okay, beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. So panel, understand that what opposition basically stands for is illegalization of drugs and making it such that if you're caught selling drugs, then it's illegal. Then the state will actually, do certain actions to ensure that you don't sell drug either ways. So I think this isn't necessarily even a case you stand for, because you need to understand, despite drug illegality, people continue using drugs. We see this in countries like Tanzania. We see this in different countries where drugs are illegal. Drug usage isn't necessarily something that you can eradicate when you make it legal or legal. But necessarily, through this stance, we don't directly get engagement of what we said in our first speech. How are we creating liberty to those individuals who use drugs? How are we taking them away from the stigmatization that they face in societies? How are we reducing the effects of drugs that generally these individuals who generally become addicts get? How are we disincentivizing black market from existing? We think this kind of engagement is what we wanted to hear in speech 1, and we think we don't not necessarily get it, and POI would help that they didn't take any POIs. We think that's also a problem, right? Let me go down into my engagement to show you how basically their stance is nothing in today's debate. So the first stance they tell us is that the most vulnerable individuals are these individuals who are drug addicts. We think we already catered for this problem in our first speech when we told you that, number one, when we put special areas where these things are going to be necessarily traded and done, we're creating a room for the government to necessarily know how they're going to use the potency which exists in drugs. We tell you that. Before marijuana was made legal, this is what happened. People used to increase the THC level in marijuana, making it such that people become easily addicted from marijuana. This is because it wasn't legal. But after its illegality, we created a room where the government was possibly able to confine or to control the potency of marijuana in making it such that the THC level, which necessarily causes addiction, is going to be reduced. We're telling you this problem of addiction within how drugs are going to be sold is going to be controlled. But secondly, we tell you that it easily becomes easy for the government to identify these individuals who need rehabilitation to stay away from, the addiction that they get from drugs. We tell you that having special areas makes it easy for the government to identify these individuals who need help. They do not tell us how rehabilitation structures in their side is going to be effective. Team Tanzania takes the rehabilitation structures and how the government is going to use potency. And a good example of this is marijuana. But secondly, they tell us drug territories is necessarily a problem. And they think that's one of the biggest issues towards violence and things like drug cartels work. Our second argument will directly cater to telling you how drug cartels are actually going to be controlled and violence are going to be controlled to help those 60,000 people who were killed in Mexico in 2007 due to drug wars, right? We're going to cater for that later. Let's go down into my argument, which will be integrated with some rebuttals and tell you why Team Tanzania takes this debate, right? Firstly, the first argument, it improves safety in individuals living in residential areas. Understand, in the status quo, 35% of drug users between 18 to 25 years in LA were found to involve themselves in youth violence, and 92% of individuals in Memphis have been, counted to be perpetuators in rape, domestic violence, and sexual violence. This is due to them, those individuals necessarily doing drugs. And 45% of these individuals directly affected the residents living in that particular. And a very good example of this is countries like Australia, which faced this problem necessarily, right? All these statistics are a result of constant drug use in residential areas, which means if drug users are not kept away from residential areas, crimes like youth violence, physical violence, and sexual abuse are likely going to be perpetuated, which directly engages to the point or to the fact that without a similar form of regulation, it is necessarily to exist. We think we're likely not going to keep safe neighborhoods because drugs will still be used either ways, right? We need to understand or to create ways in which you can separate drug users from these individuals who likely need or have to get their right of safety. Comparatively, we tell you that when buyers and users are kept in a liberal way using recreational drugs in areas where they're specially confined and allocated by the government, we think we are providing safety to residents or individuals who need the right to safety, because 92% of users who usually commit crimes when they're not kept away from residential areas, we think we're going to take them away from individuals who deserve this right to safety. We think this is necessarily a problem because you need to understand these users will still exist in both sides, right? But B, it is going to promote regulation in terms of crime rates and violence, which is being reduced in the long run, because A, the government will be able to identify those individuals who need help from addiction and constant use of drugs, which is most likely going to be an effect of violence. So we tell you that rehabilitation structures are better operated on our side of the house, which comparatively in their side doesn't provide how users, which despite illegality are going to use drugs, are going to be catered for. So they did not tell us how these drug users and drug addicts, which already existed, going to be identified by the government and helped by the government. We think this is achieved on our side. And a very good example of that is countries like, Australia, if countries like Tanzania, even if drugs are illegal, what happens is that the government fails to identify those users who still use drugs even if it's illegal. And you think this is necessarily a problem, and this is what we should address, right? So what does our first argument counter for today's motion? One, it creates safety to residents who necessarily deserve the right to safety. But two, it's strengthening rehabilitation structures since the government is likely going to know who are the individuals who are facing this problem. But thirdly, it promotes liberty to drug users, which will exist on both sides of the house. Yes, POI?
So whenever you're talking about the counterfactual that you're presenting, you're not contrasting our point on decriminalization. So what is better, decriminalization in a broad area or legalization accessible to the privileged?
We tell you, you need to understand, even if you decriminalize or you decriminalize drugs, you need to understand that drug users will still exist on your house. Tell us how drug users or drug addicts in that form will be catered for. We tell you drug users and drug addicts are likely going to be helped by the government and identify them more. But we think even engage in the area on how you're going to make residents safe on our side of the house, and we tell you that's the case, right? So secondly, having specific areas where drugs are used, bought, and sold will remove territorial dominance in residential neighborhoods. One of the biggest reasons why most streets and neighborhoods in Mexico and the United States are theater of violence is because the toxic culture of drug lords and drug cartels often perpetuate crimes. Understand that in 2006, Mexico had drug cartels wars in drug cartels like Sinaloa, Gulf, Santa Rosa de Lima. Cartels are greedy of money and control and territorial dominance. So Shena already showed you in her first speech how money and control be achieved in a divided way when special areas exist. The biggest aim of this system is to take away the competitive, violent nature of drug dealings which exist in the current world. You need to understand, even if it's illegal, 6,000 lives will continue to be sold because of the violent nature of competition which exists between drug cartels in the neighborhoods. So this is necessarily a problem. We're likely going to avoid territorial dominance in residential areas, which affects residents, and now take it to allocated, confined special areas, which have special forms of regulation and reduce severity of drug cartels. And we tell you that countries like Netherlands, which implemented something called tipo points, necessarily took away the culture of prostitution from resident areas to special areas where they're going to be practiced, which not only provides liberty to those users, but also controls the culture being taken away from neighborhoods. So this will not only take away violence from the streets, but it will benefit cartels, since money and controlled competition will likely going to be avoided. So we expect Sinaloa to have the special areas where drugs can be conducted, and another drug cartel to have the special areas to avoid that violent competitive nature which exists on both worlds. So what world are we creating, right? We're creating a world in essence where liberty and rehabilitation will exist to the buyers, safety will exist to the residents, and smooth markets which are less violent will exist to drug dealers. We need direct engagement to prove to us why these things are necessarily not important from our side of the house. So buying, selling, and using of drugs are likely going to be regulated and likely going to be confined on our side of the house. We think this is necessarily what is important. I rest my case.
We thank the previous speaker, and we now welcome the second speaker on the opposition side.
Cool. My name is Manuel. I'll be doing second op, and I rather you interrupt me for POIs. Am I audible? Okay. Okay. I want to note two things at the top of my sheet. First of all, the counterfaction in this debate, so that the comparative is extremely clear and clean in this debate. Inside opposition, we support a decriminalizing model of consumption. That is to say that if an individual is found to have drugs with them, they will not be put in jail for life. That is to say, they would not be put, for example, in death sentence. It is to say that our law enforcer can take the drugs from their person and indicate them into a rehabilitation facility. The types of mechanisms that proposition talks about that we observe. That is to say, if proposition literally wants to talk about and give refutation regarding how bad it is outside, then they should not be putting people in jail in every single scenario. If literally the biggest point that second prop makes is that people will be selling drugs anyway, that people will be consuming drugs anyway outside, then I don't think that they should put them in jail. These are the majority of people. This in many cases is people who cannot transport themselves to these types of areas. In many cases, it's poor people who will not be able to access the taxed and more expensive drugs that you have inside this area. So I'll give you a mechanism for why these drugs are more expensive, but I think that's extremely clear. The second thing I want to be very clear of is the lack of mechanism and logical links from side prop, because it is not enough for them to tell you people will consume drugs in either side. In Portugal, in Chile, and in certain cities in the United States, when you decriminalized these types of things, people stopped consuming like drugs, or at least these numbers went down. The mechanism for this, and we do give you a reason, is because in many instances these are addicts who previously did not want to approach the government, but now they are given an option when they are not considered criminals, right? In those instances, that is enough. There is no reason to create more violence into these areas. I want to give refutation, restrengthening, and a third argument on why production, irrespective of how good these areas are, is very, very bad. So first of all, I think on refutation, I think prop's case is contingent on proving to you that the average person will go to the spaces. Two reasons why we think that is not the case. The first is I think the average person who consumes drugs recreationally, whether that is marijuana or micro-injections such as with cocaine and heroin, does not have the incentive of going to these places insofar as it is not as comfortable. They are not doing it in a party or in their house as they normally would. I don't think that they have given us enough clarifications of how these places look like, and not all people would like to go to like a nightclub, as they say. The second reason is because in many instances these drugs are not as accessible, no thank you, as they normally are. That's to say, when you have a multifaceted like cartels in specific places, such as the Sinaloa cartel or the Jalisco Nueva Generación in Mexico, which are very powerful cartels. Let's say that we take them at their best, and a cartel has dominance over this market. Maria had already given analysis on why other cartels that are outside, in the best case scenario, are not violent, but will continue to sell drugs, and they will do it more cheap because they have the incentives of still having a market outside of these places. They talk about stigma, and we say that the stigma is way worse for the people that don't access these places, because now you have the narrative of saying you had a choice of going into these places. I think the type of person who is not likely to go to these places is exactly an addict, a person who doesn't want to go to a place where people are using drugs recreationally. The problem with side proposition is like they identify, no thank you, there's different types of consumers, but put different types of consumers in the same places. I think under an assumption of the harm principle from the government, it is not legitimate to incentivize people to consume other drugs that they wouldn't have just because they're in an environment where people are consuming harder drugs. There are two reasons why the government should not do and legitimize this. The first is because people cannot fully consent to these drugs, even if they have doctors giving them pamphlets or like leaflets on what these drugs entail. The first reason for this is because humans can't really materialize the harms that will happen in a month or in a few weeks when they can materialize the benefits and pleasure that they will have from consuming drugs in 1 minute. The second reason is because in many cases, these people are coerced. This is poor people, people who have just lost their jobs that are in these circumstances, not because they wanted it. The second reason here is, even if they completely can consent, as proposition kind of talks to you about, I think the government should prioritize your well-being over the consent and the choice that you can make. That's to say, even if I can completely consent to consuming crocodile, the fact of the matter is it will affect me for life and I will not be a functioning member of society. I think it is legitimate for the government to curtail that right to consent. They talk about how, no thank you, they are buying into the system and how, for example, Pablo Escobar would have entered these cartels. I think that is the worst example because when we talk about a dual clash, such as the Cali cartel in Colombia and the cartel that Pablo Escobar had, it would have been much more likely that the wars that already existed were now going to exist for these spaces. Side proposition gives you a third argument where they say now these clashes won't exist. But we think when you create more areas that these cartels are going to fight over, these problems are much worse. I think the most important thing here is the biggest cartels, the most dangerous ones, the ones that are the most powerful, are not going to enter the spaces because they don't really need protection. They can protect themselves. And the fact of the matter is when the government will tax you inside the spaces or where you have to have cleaner drugs, which means more expensive production processes drugs, it is unlikely for this to happen. Sure.
So would you rather have areas where there's divided power of cartels or cartels competitively, violently, competitively on market in particular streets? Right. So would you rather have
Thank you. So let's take them at their best where this is competitive and basically the government will choose who the best is. And let's even assume that like cartels will have to commit to being good if that means that like to be accepted. Let's say therefore that, for example, you have the Sinaloan cartel in Mexico in these zones, which is a very big, important cartel. I think even in those instances, what ends up happening is other cartels now have the incentives of being much more dangerous outside and there's less regulations because allegedly you have already solved this. I want to go into our third argument on the red tainted government. In this argument, we say that allowing dealers to operate in these spaces is legitimizing and fostering the exploitative system in which drugs are produced as the final product underwent a whole process stained with the blood of innocents and product of bad working conditions. I have two lines of analysis for you. The first is that the exorbitant accumulation of wealth from drug sales opens doors for cartels to engage in other, more harmful crimes, which is the fact that cartels are proactive in their intent to affect governments and rival cartels. For example, when operating with a billion-dollar industry, we think that the stakes are immense in every move, putting the lives of millions of people at risk. That's to say, in Latin America, for example, 1/4 of all homicides are related to drugs. And in North Africa, no thank you, criminals move both drugs and people to Europe. Imagine a person who wants to give a better life to their families, they have to transport drugs in order to enter Europe. The thing in this debate is that these activities are endemic to drug cartels. No matter if you have the monopoly on everything perfect on their side, production will always be problematic. That's to say that when the government creates these sites, consumers believe that the government endorsed groups that they previously resented, which means that you have less trust in these governments. Secondly, and second line of analysis, we think these are not legitimate processes with dignity. Take the example of rural areas where there's little government protection and oversight, where cartels are free to take land, force farmers to work for them, and change the environments, such as in Colombia, where 11 out of the 32 million hectares of tropical forest have been lost to coca. It is people who are being enslaved in Mexico so that there's like clean drugs for the elites that will go to these places in the United States, like a poppy farmer who said she felt like a slave to the drug cartels. Then there is a transportation issue, which is the cases in which, for example, in Afghanistan, which is the biggest source of heroin, a shipment may cross 10 countries to get to these places, which means many people are put at risk, even if it is on their side legal. On our side, production is still illegal, so the government can intervene. I think the next mechanism that I'll give is very important, which is the fact that now governments are more likely to take down cartels because they can, for example, put the resources that they were previously using for putting people on jails. That's to say, when in Colombia, they decriminalized certain farmers so that they could cooperate with the government, these crimes went down by 70%, and they apprehended 25 of the most wanted criminals. Why should you not do it on side proposition? Two reasons. First of all, because we think there is a moral duty to those affected in the past, to the people who have been killed with the weapons that were dealt by these groups, to the people whose family member was taken away. Second and lastly, because there is more distrust in the government. I think at the end of the debate, we have to note two things. The first, side opposition doesn't really engage with the fact that the decriminalizing model incentivizes people to talk to authorities. One of the main problems in local places, such as in Mexico, is that people literally hide people from the cartels in their homes. They're more likely to trust the government on our side. Just to be very clear, when in Tanzania they started to criminalize drugs again, people stopped going into rehabilitation centers, and the statistic is that it went 50% up on the ability of people having, for example, overdoses. Ladies and gentlemen, understanding that these people are not criminal, but giving them an option is what we stand for. We should not put the government with blood of their own citizens. We're proud to oppose.
We thank the previous speaker, and we now welcome the third speaker on proposition.
All right, am I audible enough? My name is Dulkifli Dao, and I would prefer to just interrupt me whenever you have a POI. Just unmute and ask away. I'm going to begin in 3, 2, 1. Panel, the first mistake that opposition is making is assuming that the purpose of this debate, which is decriminalization and legalization, are things that aren't mutually exclusive. We think that the biggest question in this debate is not understanding what the nature of the drug users and seller is. This debate isn't about the eradication of drugs, because OP is creating the biggest mammoth for themselves. They don't help people necessarily under their case. They tell us that police can be helped and are used for us to be able to implement this whole idea of decriminalization. We think that this is incredibly problematic because they don't account for the whole idea that the police are corrupt in themselves. They assume that the police system that they're providing for us is perfect. And this is incredibly funny because even in Mexico, we understand that the police system is incredibly rigged and influenced by the rich drug industry. Now, what is our stance and what do we believe? From the very first speech, Husseina tells you that things like addiction aren't likely to happen on our side of the house. We control things such as regulation and safety for the people, not only that are using these drugs, but those that aren't, which is something that opposition is trying to get away with. They try to get away with this whole idea that these drugs are bad in the first place and people shouldn't take them. We tell you that we're going to ensure that people take these drugs in safe amounts and in safe dosages, ensuring that their health and safety is still, catered for under our model. Ultimately, panel, we think that this debate boils down into 4 main clashes. We think the first one is regulation, second one is legality versus decriminalization, third one is liberty of drug use and harsh retribution, and fourthly, confinement of legal drug use versus open illegal drug use. Now, before I move on, some rebuttal. What we generally get from side opposition is this whole idea that people aren't going to have access to these non-residential areas. We think this is incredibly problematic. Husseina tells you that these places where people are going to be able to use these drugs, these places where people aren't going to be stigmatized when they use these drugs, aren't places that are in the outskirts of the city. These places are just like clubs. So we can't say that this whole idea of accessibility falls. We don't think that these people will necessarily not have access to these places. We think that just like clubs, these people can be able to go to these places and recreationally use these drugs. They also tell us about this whole idea that the problems of violence aren't occurring in residential areas. This is incredibly problematic because these are the same people that tell us that a number of civilians got killed in Mexico because of drug violence. How does that make any sense? This clearly tells us that these problems and violences that were occurring were in residential areas in the first place. So we do have to admit and agree that the problem, with the process of buying drugs and selling drugs can cause violence, which harms people in these residential areas. And that is why we have to move these people to places where they don't harm those that don't use these drugs. They also tell us that people aren't safe under our model, which is also something that is incredibly problematic. We tell you from the very first speech that these drugs are going to be sold in potencies and in quantities in which they ensure that the people that are using them don't fall under things such as addiction or overdosing. So the whole issue of safety will still cater for under our side. They also tell us that, people will necessarily not trust the government, unless this whole issue is decriminalized. This is also incredibly problematic in of itself. And then they bring this example of how in Tanzania, when they further criminalize these drugs, people now started to use these drugs even more. We already tell you that the issue of illegality, still isn't catered for. We tell you that as long as these drugs are still illegal, people will still try to purchase these drugs. We tell you that the issue and the root cause, of the problem in today's debate is the whole idea that these drugs are made illegal in the first place. Now, on to my first clash, which is legality versus decriminalization. Now, the big problem is that side opposition is assuming that these two things are mutually exclusive. Now, we think this is very problematic because there's a lot of advantages that we reap on our side of the house which aren't necessarily catered for on their side. Mind you, they tell us, they spend almost 5 minutes telling us this whole issue about drug lords and how we don't cater for these things. Well, under their model of decriminalization, we don't see these drug lords being catered for anyway. They don't tell us in no point in their speech how they're going to be eradicating these violences that are occurring because of these drug laws. But we already give you a model about things such as legal amnesty and about things such as these drug lords' ability to actually sit down sometimes and come to the table, because at the end of the day, drug lords care about simply their profit and the money that they make in their industry. When we already offer these people such a model, we think that they're necessarily going to buy into our system. We think that this other idea of regulation is completely not present on their model. We think that decriminalization doesn't make these drugs safe. What they're trying to say is that we should allow these people to use these drugs. Once they get addicted or once they're caught with these drugs, we give them help. Don't we see a problem with this statement? How can we allow people to take drugs that are unsafe in the first place? It's something that is completely eradicated under our model. On to my second clash, which is the issue of liberty of these drug use versus harsh retribution. Now, what we tell you on our side is that just because these people are going to be going to these non-residential areas where they're going to be using these drugs doesn't necessarily mean that these people are confined. We tell you that with true liberty lies true regulation. Things such as speech. Everyone has freedom of speech, but that doesn't mean people are allowed to have hate speech. We tell you that these people are free to use these drugs as long as they take them in safe quantities that don't necessarily harm their health. Something that is completely uncatered for under side opposition, because what they're already assuming is that these drugs that people are going to be taking are unsafe in the first place, which is something that has already been counted for and catered for since the very first speech of today's debate. On to the third clash, which is the issue of confinement of the legal drug use versus open drug use, which side opposition is telling us in today's debate. We tell you that the problem under their model is that people are going to be using these drugs in areas where they're completely not only unsafe, not only is it unsafe for the health of these people, but also, the physical harms that could be happening to these people. We give you the example of Netherlands, where they implemented such a system of tipple zones, where these prostitution houses, brothels were not in residential areas. What happened when they implemented this model is that it actually reduced the violence, especially violence that is related to things such as sexual assault and sexual abuse and rape. So we do tell you that things such as violence are catered for and these harms are catered for under our model. But before I move on, yes, I'll take your POI.
When they did the exact same amnesties that you're talking about to drug cartels in Colombia, public execution went up by more than 70%. Why is it likely for people to be happy when you are pardoning murderers?
If you heard Husseina's first speech in today's debate, she tells you that although Pablo Escobar isn't the very best example, but this is proof that these drug lords are able to sit at the table and have a conversation with the government, something that is not even offered in the first place under side opposition. They're in no way in the case with tell us how they're at least going to get these drug laws to sit on the table with the government and at least make a decision, something that they have not engaged with in today's debate at all. When they mention these problems of these drug laws, they completely don't give us any solutions. However, under our model, we tell you that things such as legal amnesty are going to be offered to these drug lords. What side opposition has done to this debate, ladies and gentlemen, is already assuming that we should allow these people to take drugs that are completely unsafe, drugs that are completely unregulated by these drug lords, in high potency, letting these people fall under addiction, and only when they do this is when we offer these people help. We think that this is incredibly problematic because we are able to solve this issue from ground level. From the very bottom, we tell you things such as addiction, high levels of potency won't exist in these drugs. We tell you that violence doesn't exist on our side of the house. And we tell you that we are at least able to offer some form of mitigation for the problems that are occurring because of the sale, the use, and the buying of drugs. If you vote for a side that actually cares for the people that use these drugs and those that don't, then you care for side proposition. Thank you.
Thank you. We now welcome the third speaker on the opposition side.
Can I ask for a favor really quick? Can we ask the coach for Team Tanzania to turn their camera off, please? Because we can't focus on the speaker sometimes. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mariana Icaza. Am I audible? Yeah. I would also like for POIs to be given verbally, please. And if you could raise your hand, that would be even more helpful. When Portugal implemented a decriminalization of drugs, there was an 85% decrease in overdoses. Portugal being the same example that Proposition 1 gave in their argument as a success story, and the same mechanism that the third proposition speaker now chooses to say we can do too. Since our first speech, we tell you our model is enough, our model can deal with the epidemic of addiction that Proposition so complains about. A few things throughout my speech. First, a really quick clash on choice and consent, and then two bigger clashes. One on consumer well-being, and the second one on cartel violence. But now let's talk about the principle in this debate. Both teams agree that the government has a duty to intervene in this epidemic of addiction. However, Proposition is the side that is enabling for further drug consumption to occur. Manuel already gave you sufficient rebuttal as to why consent is unlikely to happen, and how even if there is no consent, the government is still legitimate to do this, rebuttal which received no engagement in third proposition. But let me give you a further reason as to why the government is legitimate in intervening in these sorts of areas. And this is basically because of the harm principle. First, at an individual level, we recognize that because different individuals have different physiognomical characteristics, even the softer drugs can have alternate responses on these individuals, and therefore that is another reason why they can't consent. But we tell you that the consumption of drugs in general can lead to a lot of harm to third parties that aren't involved in the transaction of drugs in the first place. We talked to you about families that can be affected when one individual in the family is consuming these drugs. And when they themselves tell you that these are not going to be areas that are extremely patrolled or extremely regulated, we believe that the individuals in the surrounding areas are going to be affected by individuals who can't control themselves because they are under the influence of drugs, but also people inside these facilities. When we recognize that there's going to be people that are consuming different varying levels of hardness within these drugs, then a person that is just smoking marijuana being in a prison, being in the same room with a person that is consuming cocaine, we believe that that individual is at harm, and we don't believe that the government should therefore allow for this consumption of drugs to continue. No, thank you. But now let's talk about consumer well-being. First, I want to be very clear about which benefits that Proposition brings on their side also fall into ours. First, we talked about clean needles since our very first speech. But secondly, let's truly characterize what this rehabilitation looks like on our side. We believe that police officers and members of the government that see individuals consuming drugs refer them to rehabilitation centers. The second thing that we would say is that when countries have decriminalization, there's generally vans and facilities available for individuals to get clean needles and to get help in general. So the third thing that we could say is that in the moment when these individuals are no longer seen as criminals, they alone are more likely to seek out these services. That is a net benefit to our side. The only benefit that doesn't fall to our side is when we talk about the quality of drugs. But when we recognize that the higher quality of the drug, the more addictive that this drug is, we don't find this to be a substantial benefit. We believe that the aggregate of decriminalization is still better on our side. But now let's talk about the general approach of legalization in some areas versus decriminalization. We believe that under their side of the house, they have a very reactive approach to healthcare when we talk about addictors, because individuals and medical personnel, which they don't really even characterize under their side of the house because they talk about these instances as being such as clubs, only intervene where individuals are on the verge of OD. The difference is that our model is one that is preventive, when you can direct people to rehabilitation before their life is directly at risk. Now let's talk about two broad groups that are affected by this motion. First, casual users, and second, on addicts. When we talk about casual users, we believe that in these centers, because there are drug dealers everywhere, you can be directly approached and it is easier for you to consume these drugs. Versus under our side of the house, the sale of these drugs is still something that is criminalized. The second thing we told you is that these individuals are literally exposed to harder drugs within the same environment. We believe that that can change the risk perception of these drugs and make them more likely to take it. But now let's talk about stigma, something that Proposition consistently talks about. We believe that when you create these centers, you are forcing these individuals to hide out behind walls and branding them as addicts in the moment when they cross the door. We believe that in the moment when you don't criminalize the consumption of drugs, then the consumption of drugs in general is seen as a health crisis and it is more open to having conversations. We believe that stigma is less on our side. Now let's address addicts. We believe that addicts won't go to these places in the first place. And why is it? First of all, because in the moment when literally the government is putting you in jail when you step out of this door, we don't believe that the individuals who are actively prosecuted by the government will trust it enough to use its facilities. But the second thing we told you is that because this becomes part of the legal market, then the price of these drugs is necessarily going to rise, which means that the most vulnerable individuals, which has a direct correlation with the level of addiction, will literally be priced out, and everyone has a lesser incentive to consume because it is more expensive. Before I move on, go.
So on your side of the house, how are you identifying and helping drug users who are already addicted?
Look, we believe that individuals who are addicted on the street can be easily identified, but I also gave you the analysis as to why it is likely that individuals themselves are going to go to these centers without them having to be like directly tracked down. But now, why is it important for the debate that these individuals are unlikely, no thank you, to go to these centers? First, because in spite of the potential like health benefits that they don't even really characterize, they have a minimal impact. Secondly, because when we recognize that the majority of people are going to be outside these centers, they are going to be worse off, because the idea is that these people at least had the chance of going to these centers, and therefore their health crisis is directly their fault. But the thirdly is that we believe that the government does have an opportunity cost in investing in these sorts of centers. That is money that it cannot use on rehabilitation and other services that can be more beneficial to these individuals. But now let's talk about cartel violence. First, it is important to note that the definition of non-residential areas can also be like parks or areas near schools or even the clubs that they talk about. So when I talk to you about violence, please imagine this violence actually like attacking third-party individuals who have nothing to do with the transaction. But even if this violence occurs inside, we believe that consumers are a significant stakeholder in this debate. And if they are in the crossfire of drug dealers, that is something that you should also care about. But now, briefly on like clarification, if they characterize that drug dealers have a lot of competition outside of these areas, then the same incentive applies for them to have competition within these areas, because like they literally want profit. But if we take them at their best case scenario where the government is able to like regulate these things, we believe that necessarily it's not going to choose certain drug cartels, and therefore these cartels will likely to backlash either against the government or simply take other actions to increase their profit, which is also detrimental for society. But their model is essentially to grant these groups amnesty and give them stable profits. This assumes two things. One, that the drug dealers will accept, and two, that they will stop committing crimes. I don't believe that that is likely, because drug dealing is $1 billion industry. Seeing, for example, the Sinaloa cartel that has a presence in over 30 countries. We believe that the profits that they use fund networks of crime, such as arms sales, forced disappearances, murder, kidnap. These are things that are still actively profitable, and there's no reason that they tell you that they are unlikely to do these harms in the future. But even if they were to do so, we believe that the very fact that you're permitting for the production of these drugs to still happen already incurs harms from third parties, as Manuel told you in their third argument, which got no rebuttal. But now in the counterfactual, we tell you that the government can use resources strictly to target these individuals because it doesn't spend money on like tracking individual consumers or like jail that is also extremely expensive. But the second thing we tell you is that the government and the people can now have a relationship based on trust, which means that individuals are more likely to give information to the government about these cartels. We believe that that provides for like a greater information for the government, and that is something that is beneficial. When you deal with drug dealers, you are losing legitimacy, you are losing public trust, and that is crucial for the fight against drug dealers. I am so very proud to oppose.
Thank you. We now welcome the reply speaker on opposition side.
Am I audible? Cool. Side proposition says authorities are very weak, particularly in countries like Mexico. Yet it will be those same authorities, the ones that will protect this area so that other cartels are not clashing. Side proposition changed strategies throughout this debate, because at one moment they talk about how successful or bad this decriminalization model can be, and in third prop they say that it is not mutually exclusive. Look, even if they can do this too, I think it is not a fair comparison when we can't really answer to that. But even if, I am going to prove through 2 points of clash how the existence of these zones in themselves have lost in the debate through the analysis that we have already given, irrespective of whether you have decriminalization, which I think has been clear enough of a successful alternative on our side. First point on consumption, second point on the environment. First point on consumption. Side proposition says these drugs will be clean. The first thing that we have asked is, why is that the case, right? Because in no moment in this debate have they given you 10 seconds of analysis of what is the case, whether they're going to have doctors or what's going to happen. But let's assume that they have doctors, that they have regulations, that they have the best types of drugs. I think even if that is the case, that doesn't ensure that these people have a better quality of life. We gave you significant analysis in second and third for why the fact that you can put crocodile, for example, on your body, or heroin, doesn't necessarily mean that even if it's the best version of that drug, that it is good for you. And we told you that they cannot consent in many instances, which makes it more illegitimate. We gave you 2 reasons for consent. First of all, because in many instances, these people can't quantify the problems that will happen in the future, even if they factually know what is going to happen. Second of all, because in many cases, they are coerced by the poverty, by the social needs that they have, etc. In many cases, we told you, even if these people can fully consent, the government should care more about their health. The response that we hear from Prop is, but they still can choose. We think when the choice was one that was coerced, that was not enough. We have given you 3 reasons for why people are not going to go to the spaces that they should have engaged with. The first is because many people are not comfortable. I think if I don't like a club because I'm an introvert, I just won't go to these places. Inside a position doesn't tell you what happens outside other than a very shaky stance on whether they will decriminalize or not. I think like these problems are much harder, and you have more stigma on their side when you had the choice of going to these places. The second point that we give is these people won't go because in many instances it is cheaper to buy outside. I gave you analysis in second for why other cartels that are not going to be there, because surprise, surprise, it's impossible for you to have all cartels in these areas, are going to sell cheaper outside. I think insofar as these people will consume, specifically the most vulnerable, such as addicts, they will stay outside and you can't help them. Third, because you have a lot of surveillance. We give you significant analysis in second, and particularly in third, for why a person who previously didn't trust the government won't go to these places. Note that the mechanism that we give you in our third argument that is never responded to is that these people literally hate cartels, and they won't go to places in which literally the groups that killed their families are selling drugs, even if they are addicts themselves. But I think the stigma is worse. Lastly, we told you 2 things on consumers. First of all, is the fact that under the harm principle, it is wrong for you to affect others. So we did answer to the principle. We did say, if you are incentivizing other people to consume drugs that they previously wouldn't have consumed, then that is a problem. We think that these people are likely to go on their own under our system when they need rehabilitation. Second point on the environment. I think that there is a problem for them to bring a third argument that says, now this clash won't exist in residential areas. It normally doesn't ever happen in residential areas. It happens in places such as the ones that they propose, places where they will be able to sell drugs without being penalized. I think the clash that exists is much harder. They say, we talked about production, which never really was engaged with, and this is irrespective of anything else. Even if these zones are perfect, because they have to go through very bad processes, that is a big problem. That is to say that now they can expand the market for enslaving people, and that is principally wrong. We said just because these organizations previously killed people with the weapons that they dealt, that was enough of a principal reason not to deal with them. We said that they're giving them stable income so that they can deal weapons, traffic human beings, traffic organs. We think there's more violence outside, because as we said in second, the fact of the matter is, even if Sinaloa consents to enter these areas, because another cartel won't, now it is less likely for that cartel to be regulated. We relocate resources to go for the ones who are producing the problems. I think this debate is more than clear. A ballot for Team Mexico we are so proud to oppose.
Thank you. We now welcome the reply speaker from the proposition side.
Am I audible? Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. We want to live in a world where people are not stigmatized and prosecuted for the way that they choose to live their lives. We want to live in a world where innocent families aren't caught in the crossfire of gang violence that plays out in our homes and in our neighborhoods. We want to live in a world where drugs should not be the end of you simply because they're unregulated and unsafe, because the drugs are not what are bad, but rather how much of them are taken in. We want to live in a world where drug users are allowed to use drugs at liberty, and drug addicts are better able to be identified and rehabilitated. Side opposition brings to us a case of total illegalization of drugs with criminal apprehension for anyone who is caught buying or selling. The only stakeholder they identify in today's debate and claim to be able to protect are drug addicts, forgetting that drug users who aren't necessarily addicts still exist, residential neighborhoods still exist, and drug lords and drug cartels who only know the way of violence still exist. They bring to us a case of claiming to be able to protect people through current forms of rehabilitation, when we all know and we have proven without the identification of addicts, you cannot rehabilitate them. And identification only happens better under our world, because there's no way that an addict is going to willingly come to rehabilitate himself, because that just doesn't happen. This is why their case just simply doesn't stand a chance to win today's debate, right? One, Mexico fails to acknowledge all of the problems brought to the table by me in my first speech. We tell you illegalization doesn't work because, as proven by us, despite illegality, people still continue to buy, use, and sell drugs. Mexico fails to tell us how rehabilitation under the current status quo is the way to go, when we have told you that the current status quo is aimed rather at retribution than rehabilitation, with drug sentences being even harsher than, say, third-degree murder sentences. 3, Mexico paints a world where the only drug users that exist are drug addicts. Thus, their policy of if someone is caught with drugs, they will be sent to a rehab. But see, not everybody who is caught with drugs, or not everybody who consumes drugs, are actually drug addicts. See, some people are just simply drug users who use drugs to relieve stress. People we cater for under our side. If Mexico believes that these people are ill, how do they justify criminal apprehension as the best solution in this very instance? If Mexico would have taken a POI in their first speech, we would have asked them, what are you defending? The safety of the people and their comfort, or corrupt police who will take bribes and are already working with these drug lords anyway? They lose this debate because they do not engage with us on the 3 main different levels that we brought to the table: the buying, the using, and the selling of drugs, but rather just bring to us a very contradictory world where they claim that the only people who exist are drug addicts who are sick, but under the same breath bring to us a system of criminal apprehension. They claim that drug addicts will be easily identified on the streets and will willingly go to these centers, something we have proven is historically untrue through the bench, and this is why we actually need a system reform in the first place, right? Mexico loses this debate because they fail to cater for any stakeholders of the debate. Drug users, they completely ignore the existence of people who use drugs simply because they want to relieve stress. They're not addicted. Drug addicts, they fail to protect these people because their model doesn't even identify, first of all, these people very well. Instead, they force them to even shy further away and force them into the shadows because of the fact they've criminalized drug practices, right? But rather, under our world, we create an environment where these people can come to us and we can identify them and rehabilitate them to the best of our abilities. They fail to protect residential neighborhoods, one of the most important stakeholders in today's debate, as identified by side prop speech 1. Mexico decides to completely ignore the fact that these people are even in danger because they do not engage with Eric in any way that is effective enough for them. We tell you under the clash of safety, the whole moving drug practices non-residential area is to protect these residential neighborhoods from things like gun shootings and domestic violence that happens of being under the influence or being high. It is to protect them from gang violence that comes about from drug lords and drug cartels. Under our world, protect residential neighborhoods because we separate them from the people who necessarily cause these issues in the first place. Mexico vouches for a world where all people who consume drugs are automatically drug addicts who are sent directly to rehab. They vouch for a world where they do not care that these people actually take in these drugs in unsafe and unregulated amounts, but rather only care about helping these people after they have suffered the consequences of taking in these drugs in unsafe and unregulated amounts. They lose this debate because their whole case is a failing status quo. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. The judges are now going to move to a separate room to think about these things, and we will return to this room when we have a decision to discuss with you. So we encourage the debaters to just like hang out with each other and have fun. Until then.